for me has been cutting through the hype and the rhetoric, and figuring out what the actual issues are underlying the conversation. I think the debate in Israel has become so fraught, and so many other issues have been sort of lumped in with the core issue, which of course is this controversial judicial reform, that it becomes hard to tell the wheat from the chaff. What is it that people are actually getting so incensed about? Is it justified? Are the fears real? And the bottom line is that the fears are real, meaning even if the particular piece of legislation that was passed on Monday is in itself not particularly consequential, and it's really actually not, relative to the rest of the judicial reform that we've been promised will come, it has become sort of totemized in a way. It's become symbolic in a manner that I think has many people extremely concerned that this is the beginning of the end of Israeli democracy. This could be the beginning of Israel's demise as a society. And you see these fault lines developing within Israel that are really troubling, right? You see some of the most sacred cows of Israeli society being slaughtered one by one. So the notion that the army is a source of national cohesion, that may no longer be the case, as we have thousands of Israeli reservists saying that they'll refuse to serve if this legislation goes through. The medical profession, which again is one of the pillars of Israeli society and is a real unifying force. You encounter people of all backgrounds in Israeli hospitals and clinics. That too has been at the center of the debate, as thousands of doctors are now threatening to leave Israel because they feel that it's not a place where they can feel at home. And so it is certainly something that is of tremendous, a source of tremendous angst, I think, for many Israelis at the moment. But my job as an editor is sort of to cut through the emotion and figure out what are the facts, what is most important for my readers to know at any given moment, and how to make sure that we're conveying that information in the most neutral and unbiased way that we possibly can.
Yeah, and that can't be easy. This morning, and I was sitting in shul and reading Kinot, which are these very complex medieval acrostic poems about tragedy, and I came along this line, and it really made me think about the conversation we're having. In the land of my heritage, a heavy yoke weighs heavy upon me. How can I be consoled? And the kina, this lamentation, actually ends va'az enachem, and then I was consoled. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, Avi, when you look at this, what are the lessons you've learned? What's the consolation? Is there any consolation? Is it too early to even have that conversation because we're just really in this place of deep fragmentation?
Well, I think what's been so interesting about this debate is that it's caused many latent grievances in Israeli society to bubble to the surface in ways that I think people hadn't anticipated. So a lot of the proponents of the judicial reform are folks who associate with the religious right in Israel, who are part of the national religious camp that is largely associated with Israel's right wing. And many of them remember the disengagement from Gaza almost 20 years ago, where they felt that the judicial system, and particularly the Supreme Court, were insufficiently supportive of the residents of that territory who were being pulled out of their homes. And they view this as an opportunity to really stick it to the court almost 20 years later. And if people thought that they had forgotten or forgiven, it's clear that that is not the case, and that a lot of that pain very much remains, that is sort of propelling them forward in this conversation. You have differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Israelis, which are coming to the fore. The perception, again, on the part of many of the proponents of this legislation is that the courts are dominated by a left-wing Ashkenazi secular elite, and they feel that they've gotten the short end of the stick for decades, that they've been maligned, that they've been unfairly treated by the courts. And again, this is their opportunity to stick it to a system that they view as fundamentally unfair. And so to see those grievances bubbling to the surface in a way that I think many people didn't really expect to see has been really quite jarring. But also, I think to your question about what we've learned, I think it just teaches us that you really can't neglect that sense of of disenfranchisement, that those grievances, they really have to be dealt with. And in some sense, I would say that this is actually a cathartic moment for Israel, that a lot of these deep emotive topics are finally coming to the surface in a way that hopefully will enable us to really deal with them once we pass this crisis, which hopefully we will do. Some have suggested, and my predecessor has a column in tomorrow's paper that suggests that this might be Israel's constitutional moment, that maybe out of all of this, we can actually emerge with a written constitution, which Israel has never had in the 75 years of its existence. One can only hope. I don't know if that will happen, but it does feel like this is a significant moment in the life of Israel, and we can only hope that we'll emerge from it stronger than we were before.
Yeah, I mean, as you're speaking, Avi, it dawns on me, it's almost like an archaeological dig where there's all these layers of sediment. And so something comes to the surface and it brings up all these other layers of tragic or difficult moments in Israeli history that haven't really been healed, almost like a bone fracture that doesn't get healed. And then things that you do currently sort of put pressure on it. I've been paying attention, obviously all of us have, to writers and politicians and rabbis and Israeli citizens who seem to see this as an existential marker for the country. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Look, I don't want to, obviously in the past week and the weeks leading up to the legislation, I think a lot of people have tied this moment in Israel's national life to the period on the Jewish calendar. As we commemorate the destruction of the two temples, there are those who've asked, are we about to see the destruction of the third Jewish Commonwealth? I think that's a little overblown. I don't think that we're there. But I don't want to minimize the moment that we are in. I can't remember a period, at least in my life or my consciousness, where Israel has been so divided, not over external issues, but over internal ones. And I think that that's something that bears consideration and bears a great deal of thought, and quite frankly, bears responsibility on the part of our leadership. And I don't know that our leadership has been terribly responsible, and I blame both sides, quite frankly. I think some of the rhetoric, much of the rhetoric, has been very incendiary, very divisive, which serves certain political purposes on both sides, but ultimately is not in the best interest of this country, which really does feel as though it's being torn apart from within. So I do think that it is a significant and pivotal moment in the life of Israel. Would I say that it is something that has existential ramifications? I'm not sure I would go there quite yet, but we'll see how next few months proceed. There are those who've suggested, including the Prime Minister, that the Knesset recess, which is about to start in the next few days, will be an opportunity for negotiations to start anew. The Prime Minister has set November as a deadline for concluding those negotiations. He says it's plenty of time. It is, a significant amount of time. And the issues are significant, but they're not insurmountable. And actually, if you look at the positions that both the opposition and the coalition have staked in this, they're not actually that far apart. And Yair Lapid, who's the leader of the opposition, has himself in the past voiced support for reform of the court. I wonder how much of this are genuine sort of disagreements on the content and the actual matter at hand, and how much of it is politicking around. Again, I hope that our leaders are able to cut through those politics and cut through their respective egos and get to an agreement that will ultimately be in the country's best benefit.
Yeah, I want to get back to the leadership, but first, as an editor, I'm sure you see not only articles, but you see photos. Do you have a photo which you say, this image was just heartbreaking for me, and this image was consoling for me? This image gave me hope.
I think,
because I think for us, all we have are in the diaspora are articles and photos and videos, and so we're seeing, we don't even know if it's representative of what's really happening. We're given someone else's lens.
Right. So we have a process in the paper, obviously, of determining what photos will go with which stories, and then which photo will be sort of the big photo on the front page of the paper. And the other day, as we were sort of going through the photos that would potentially appear on the next day's front page, there was one photo that really stuck with me. And it was an image of a man holding an Israeli flag that was sort of limp and not waving in the wind. And he was being hit by a water cannon. He was hit by the spray of a water cannon. He was sort of like reeling backwards. And that to me was a really painful image because there's a symbol, of course, with which I identify, as do many of us, being targeted by Israel's own police as part of this very painful protest and this painful debate. And I think that was something that was a moment where it really sort of came to me that this is something that affects all of us, and that we're all on the same side in terms of wanting a better future for the country. But the fact that an Israeli policeman could be hitting an Israeli flag in the course of it is something that really struck me. In terms of a hopeful image, I think many of us saw a video clip that was circulating a couple of days ago. The Prime Minister mentioned it in his remarks after the vote went through, of the escalators at the Jerusalem train station, with protesters in favor and against the judicial reform going up and down the escalators as they were going to and from their respective protests. And at various points, you could see protesters on either side of the debate reaching across the divide and holding hands and touching hands. And that was a really beautiful image. There are some who suggested cynically that it was staged or wasn't real. I'd like to believe it was real, and that these are people who, even though they're divided by their views on this particular issue, are united by their sense that they're all Israeli and they all just want the best for the country. And so I draw strength and I draw hope from those moments of simple humanity, and I hope that will carry us through this troubling moment in our lives, in our nation's history.
Yeah, so I want to get to what brings us together at this troubling time.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about unity. We talk about the fact that we are one, and then we look closely, not even so closely, and say, are we really one? I think that's true for what's going on in Israel versus North American Jewry or world Jewry, but certainly, the stopgap for the fishers in Israel. Do you think unity is realistic? Do you even have a definition of what that could look like?
Rabbi Sacks spoke about the dignity of difference, and he also spoke about the importance of being unified without being uniform. And I think that those are two thoughts that I bear in mind as I look at the debates happening in Israel today, not only on this issue, but on a range of other issues. It's okay to have differences. It's okay to have diversity and a pluralism of views and perspectives. But I think at the end of the day, it's important to also bear in mind that we do have this glue that connects us, this collective memory and this collective vision and this collective future that we ultimately share. And I think that one of the things that has really been a source of inspiration to me and to many who have been observing and even been a part of these protests has been that whether they're on one side of the debate or the other, in favor of the reform or against the reform, with the government or against it, the symbol that has been most closely associated with this entire conversation has been the Israeli flag. And oftentimes we'll be standing here in our office. I'm right here in my office in Jerusalem, and we have sort of a panoramic view of the area in which many of these protests have been taking place. We can't tell who's who by looking from our windows. We just see a bunch of Israeli flags going in one way or the other. And to my mind, that is unity. Even if we are protesting on either side of this very contentious debate, at the end of the day, we want what's best for our country. We want our children and our children's children to grow up in a place that is robustly democratic and also proudly Jewish. And I think that is the very core of the debate, but it's also what really sort of unites us as a people and as a nation. And so to me, that's what unity looks like. It's not being uniform at all times, and we certainly will have a diversity of views on any number of issues, but to know that there's still something that does unify us, that there's this glue that holds us together. And again, in this particular case, it really has been the Israeli flag and the future of this country.
Yeah, that's a beautiful image. I do want to invite, if anyone has questions that you'd like to put in the chat for Avi, now's a good opportunity, and I'll read those questions. Avi, for those of us who are across the sea and several thousand miles away, what can we be doing? What should we be doing? I think a lot of us feel confused, and we're looking for clarity, and we're looking for ways to help.
Well, I think the most important thing is to remain informed and to follow the conversation in all different perspectives in the conversation to the best of your ability. I would suggest you do that at jpost.com, Jerusalem Post, of course. But there are other news outlets out there that are also doing a very good job. And if they are doing the job they should be doing, and many of them are, they will be presenting all the different sides of this debate. And I say with a great deal of pride that we have made a concerted effort to do exactly that. We have a certain editorial perspective on the reform and on the way it's been advanced, and we say that robustly every day on the pages of our opinion section. But we also provide a platform for folks who hold other perspectives, those on either side of the debate, those who feel that the government isn't going far enough, those who feel that the government has gone way too far, those who feel that the reform is being advanced too slowly, those who feel that it's been way too fast. All those are legitimate perspectives in our eyes, and we have provided a platform, really a marketplace of ideas, to share that with the world. So I would say the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is to ensure that you are staying abreast of the issues and that you are trying to understand the scope of perspectives that exist on this issue, because there are so very many. I would just say one more thing, which is that a lot of the rhetoric that you're hearing is really meant for a domestic audience. Concerns about the future of Israel and of Israeli democracy, and that if this reform goes through, then it's the end of Israeli democracy, or if it doesn't go through, then Israel was never really a real democracy. A lot of that is meant for domestic consumption, and it serves a certain political purpose within Israel. I would take it with a grain of salt. So yes, it is a fraught conversation. It is a tough moment in the life of this country. But Israel's end is not nigh, and that is not something that any of us should be concerned about. Israel needs your support now. Israelis on both sides of this debate, I'm sure, would love to hear from you. But this is not the moment to abandon Israel, to fear for its future. It's a moment to be sort of fascinated by this democratic process that's taking place within Israel, and that hopefully should serve as a source of pride for us all.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, we're witnessing the democratic process. So for all the people who are thinking this is the end of democracy, we're actually witnessing democracy, if you like, at its best. People
Absolutely.
Very, very mission driven. We have a few questions. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions as neutral politically as possible. But we have one question from Bainam Dayanim. Does Avi really think the vision of a Jewish and democratic state is a unifying vision shared by all factions of Israeli society? Or are the differences so great that they don't even agree on those core principles, or perhaps interpret democracy quite differently?
I wouldn't say that it unites all of Israeli society. There are certainly segments of Israel's population that don't agree with one or either of those propositions. I would identify perhaps large parts of the Arab community in Israel, some parts of the Haredi community in Israel, and others as well that wouldn't necessarily believe that both parts of that identification of Israel as a Jewish democratic state necessarily need to exist or ought to exist in this country. But I would say that the overwhelming majority of Israelis, from right to left, religious, secular, including many in the Arab community, do acknowledge that those are the fundamental underpinnings of Israel, and that ultimately this entire conversation centers on how to best embody those values going forward.
I just came across the term in Daniel Gordis's new book, Impossible Takes Longer, ethnic democracy, which is a little bit different than our standard use of democracy or the democratic understanding that we have in the United States. It's sort of that there's culturally a majority at the same time as we acknowledge the existence of other ethnicities and religions.
For sure.
Do you think that works? Do you think that's true democracy, ethnic democracy?
Yeah, I mean, look, here's the thing. The United States is actually kind of anomalous in that it's not a nation state. Most of the countries in the world are actually nation states. There is a dominant ethnic group that represents the largest segment of the population, or a plurality of the population, and that sort of sets a certain tone for national life. So that exists in Japan and in Albania and in Greece and other places in the world. And no one would suggest that those are not democracies just because they have a certain unique national character. I would say the same of Israel. It is true that we are a Jewish state in the sense that the majority of people here are Jewish and it has a uniquely Jewish character, but that in no way undermines our ability to be a democratic state. And I think we can always aspire to be more democratic. We can aspire to have a more perfect union in that sense in this country. But I don't think that there's any inherent contradiction between Israel having a uniquely Jewish character and also a robustly democratic system of government.
Okay. Evelyn Levine says, would you say the Israel protest movement has accomplished anything? Or I'll frame it differently. What has it accomplished?
Well, it's accomplished a great deal. There have been several moments in the history of this debate, certainly since this government came into being at the end of the last year, where this legislation could have been pushed forward much more quickly and much more resolutely, and it was the protest movement that prevented that from happening. There was one moment that really stands out where just before Pesach, Passover, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, spoke out publicly in favor of a compromise and said that the government should pause the legislation until after the holiday. The prime minister fired him for being insubordinate. And Israelis in their masses flooded the streets. The country essentially shut down. There was a massive strike. The airport was closed. Embassies around the world closed their doors. And the prime minister was essentially forced to concede that that is what had to happen. And he announced that he was indeed freezing the legislation. He reinstated the defense minister very shortly thereafter. And I think that is a very clear moment where the protest movement had a very defined objective that actually was achieved in the sense that they were able to push off the legislation. I think that the fact that there are so many in Israel's government and in its governing coalition who feel that the legislation has been advanced too hastily, too quickly, who are now in favor of some kind of negotiation, trying to reach some kind of an agreement, is also a credit to the protest movement, which has made its voice extremely loud and has really reverberated around the world. And I think the fact that I actually believe that we are likely to see some kind of a compromise. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but this is a sentiment that's shared by pretty much all of the national leaders that I've spoken to on both sides of the debate, that the legislation is not likely to go through as it was originally conceived. And I think that is largely a credit to the massive movement of people who have voiced their concerns and their opposition to that legislation.
Yeah, I mean, the prime minister did say that it was time to talk to the opposition. So I guess the question is, what does that talk amount to? I'm interested if you've covered stories from protesters who feel deeply deflated and defeated right now, and their own feelings about the future of Israel. We hear sort of stories, people are getting second passports, they're moving businesses out of Israel as a result. Is that something that you feel is sort of that initial drama, but things will calm down? Or do you feel that really will be the case and we'll see a change in the landscape?
Look, I think that we're about to enter a cooling off period where no legislation will be advanced because the Knesset will be in recess. And so I think the tenor of the debate is likely to just naturally subside. And so I think a lot of the hysteria that we saw this week, again, on both sides of the debate, is likely to quiet down as well. Yes, we have seen Facebook groups fill up with thousands of people saying that they're looking to relocate to other countries, that they don't want to raise their children in Israel, and so on and so forth. I don't know how likely that is to happen. I think at the end of the day, most Israelis want to stay and fight for their country. And even those of my friends on either side of the debate, but particularly those who oppose the legislation and who initially said things like, this is the end of the country, this is the end of democracy as we know it, are going back into the streets tonight. They announced that they are going to restart the demonstrations upon the end of the Tisha B'Av fast, and that is now, and there are now demonstrations taking place in Tel Aviv. They're there. And if they were so deeply committed to leaving the country, I suspect they would not be out in the streets fighting for the future. Yeah,
they'd be packing. Exactly. Well, look, we have a similar, in American presidential elections where people say, oh, so if so-and-so gets voted, I'm moving to Canada. I don't know how many people actually move to Canada. But I guess it sort of is a dramatic expression of a very profound sentiment, which is this my country, right? Do I feel at home here? And I think it's important, the idea that people are still protesting because this is worth saving, right? There's only one Israel, and we have to sort of honor the dignity of the political process. And part of that is protesting. I think for many Americans who are not used to protesting or used to protest movements, it feels very frightening. So I want to get back to that question about what we should be doing besides being informed. Is this a good time to visit Israel?
It's always a good time to visit Israel. I would say
that's exactly what I hoped you'd say.
I would say July and August are not the best time to visit Israel, just because it's so very hot here. But I will say, if you're in New York and you're used to the humidity, or even in the DC area, and you're used to that humidity, Jerusalem is beautiful and has a nice dry heat at the moment. But we are hitting heat records. So just in terms of this particular 2-month period of time, I'm not sure that I would visit, but now is a great time to book your flights for the holiday season and later in the year. Yes, it's always a good time to visit Israel. I have quite a lot of friends who were here over the past few weeks as tourists, who either went to observe the protests or actually participated in them on either side of the debate. They actually said it's an exciting moment to be here, to see democracy in action, to see people standing up for what they believe in and actually advocating for their visions for a better Israel. I think it is an inspiring moment to be in this country. And look, I again don't want to minimize the fears. There are people who really are concerned and have been made to be concerned by what's going on. And I want to say that it's not so much about the legislation itself, but rather about what the legislation could enable. Different shifts in the balance between religion and state in this country, concerns about an increased role for the rabbinate in the lives of Israelis, that a particular vision of Judaism will be imposed on national life in Israel. Those are real fears and concerns that people have. And I don't want to minimize that. But first of all, I think that's a long ways away. What happened this week is not likely to bring that about. I am hopeful that the next few months will see progress towards a negotiated resolution, which hopefully will actually come into being. And regardless of what's happening here, regardless of the conversations that are happening or the issues that are at the core of Israeli society, this is always a place that every Jew in the world should feel at home. There are many other aspects to Israeli life that are going underreported because they're not as dramatic at this moment, but they're no less inspiring and no less beautiful. And I certainly encourage everyone who has the opportunity to come here and see them for themselves.
It is 2:30. We need to give Avi an opportunity to get back to the newsroom so that he can close the paper tonight at 11 and so that we can get our Jerusalem Post for Friday. Avi, I mentioned this kinah that resolves itself v'az and achem, and then we'll be comforted, then I'll be comforted. I feel more comfort in the conclusion of this conversation than its beginning. So I'm grateful for this conversation, particularly on Tisha B'Av, a time where we think about tragedy and we think about disunity and we pray for peace and unity. And we want to thank you for your service to the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Som Kal, may you conclude the fast well.
Som Kal, everyone.